So next up, we have object-oriented oncology, how we make sense of complex patient journeys, presented by Georgie and Ghazaleh. Take it away, guys.
All right, thank you so much. So thanks. Our presentation today is made up of kind of three stories that we're going to weave together so that you can understand where we are going and why we're trying to work on this. So the first of those stories is about open science communities and the role of data standards for generating real-world evidence. And the second is specifically about oncology research. And then the third is more about research translation, or the path that you have to take from the insight to making an impact in the clinic, where you embed findings from research into care delivery to make a real difference for patients. And I think on the surface, those stories might not look like they're intentioned terribly much. And in fact, in a lot of ways, they are different sides of the same coin. But when you look a bit closer, we find that there's a bunch of subtle ways that there actually are competing priorities. And I think the title of this presentation, as well as the fact that we're at PyCon, probably gives a fair amount of our solution away, to be honest. So it's a spoiler alert. It has a lot to do with Python objects and ORMs. So Ghazaleh and I are joining you here today from a group called Maridulu Budjari Gumal, or SPHERE, which is a multidisciplinary translational research network that is made up of health system and academic partners, and it covers a lot of southern Sydney. So these are the organisations that make up the SPHERE network. And I think the most helpful thing to know about the translational centres and how they work is that they've been set up to deliver research that is embedded into healthcare to improve health outcomes and equity. And it means that typically researchers have appointments at multiple institutions that facilitates a flow of data, resources and expertise across the system. So the work that we're sharing today represents the efforts of a team that straddles Southwestern Sydney Local Health District, the University of New South Wales and the Ingham Institute for Applied Medical Research. Specifically, we're a part of the Cancer Clinical Academic Group, and I like to share this slide in presentations because I think it illustrates really the multidisciplinary nature of our work, where we are embedded with clinical leadership and clinician researchers all across the cancer care continuum. So every one of our clinical colleagues actively practices clinical cancer care delivery in parallel with their research, and we also collaborate with implementation scientists who are there to help us work with the people and the processes of the health system. And again, with PyCon being the clue, although overall we are a multidisciplinary gang, our home specifically is in the reducing variation in clinical practice area of focus, which is the one that's the most strongly aligned with data science and research data platform development efforts. So specifically, our overarching mission is to use routinely collected observational data to study what is unwarranted variation in clinical cancer care. I'd say that warranted variation comprises treatment that deviates from what is considered the evidence-based care, but it's due to reasons specifically around patients' comorbidities or informed patient decision-making. Whereas the residual variation that can't be explained in those ways represents treatment that's actually substandard, and that's our target for increasing understanding and interventions. So the goal is to use routinely collected data to generate evidence for best practice care across all cancer domains. And we broke this into kind of general families or shapes of questions. Our first step is characterising the type of variations that exist. I think that most health consumers probably would be surprised at the gap that exists between what their expectations are and the actual level of oversight and business intelligence that happens at a clinical level. Simply describing the systemic gaps and where they exist can already be incredibly powerful. But once we've actually measured that variation, we face the more difficult and more abstract task, understanding why that variation exists. And that's essential because without it, we can't know whether or not the particular difference in care is warranted. So we need to know who's experiencing the variation, which populations are affected, and are they affected in disproportionate fashion? And in what ways? And then so what? So which outcomes can we actually attribute to that variation? What differences it makes to patients and providers, or to the system as a whole? And finally, the holy grail that we've got is what can we actually do about it? What capacity do we have to to make a change there and reduce the unwarranted variation? And what kinds of actions make an actual difference in practice? So if we start with the first story, open science communities and data standards for real-world evidence. In a clinical trial setting, everything is very, very well tightly controlled, and that protocols are specified very rigidly, which includes strong restrictions as to which patients can even take part in the trial. And there are reasons that this does make sense. It's much, much easier to work out how well a treatment is working if you remove the complexities of a mixed population. This is on top of the fact that trial participation risks vary a lot depending on different groups. So it means that frail patients, those with a lot of multiple other conditions at the same time, and the elderly, for example, are often excluded. But the catch is that for cancer, those specific excluded populations are the ones who look like the patients that are actually seen in the clinic most of the time. And the gap between the world of protocols and the world of practice is just one of the myriad arguments for why real-world evidence matters so much. There are a lot of challenges with this, but a big one is scale. So to generate compelling evidence in a noisy real-world context, you need a huge amount of data. To make sure that those insights are actually generalizable, the data has to come from disconnected sources, including administrative records, registries, different institutions, and different care settings. And of course, scaling the data brings with it a very real risk to patient privacy. And most of the time, the preferred solution is not to pool all of this data in a central location. Instead, we use the approach of federated analytics, where basically the data stays as close as it can to the generating institution. It may be inside its generating network, or it may be in an associated group, but certainly not sending it to a central pool. And then we use careful data harmonization to allow us to run study packages in a distributed fashion. So I'm going to hand over to Ghazaleh now to help you understand some of the ways that we work towards that properly federated network, the common data model.
Thanks, Georgie. Yes, to make federated analytics and network studies possible, we need a shared language for the data set itself. That's where common data models come in. The idea is simple. Every institution can keep its own system and structures, but data is transformed through ETL pipelines into a standard format that everyone agrees on. Once that's done, the same analysis can run in many different places, and the results can be combined. One of the most widely used approaches in health research is the OMOP common data model. It gives us a consistent way to represent clinical data, and it's supported by an open science community, Odyssey community, that builds tools and methods on top of it. But designing a single model that works across every institution, every clinical domain, and every use case is a hugely ambitious task. Here's the catch. When you try to build a model that does everything, you have to make trade-offs. To cover all these different use cases, common data models like the OMOP common data models usually choose flexibility over ease of use. Most of the details comes from the vocabularies, the vocabularies they linked to, rather than from complex relationships between the tables. That's why clinical contexts like events, measurements, treatments, and outcomes is stored in a fairly simple domain-specific tables. Of course, these design trade-offs come with their own challenges. In this table, we can see the main design choices behind OMOP. A lot of OMOP's flexibility comes from using linked vocabularies to carry meaning rather than building strict rules into the database itself. That makes it flexible, but it also means it's harder to enforce rules, capture complex relationship, or answer detailed questions with simple queries. And let's be honest, most people using these data models are clinicians first, researchers second, and only reluctantly database experts. So the result is often long, complex queries that build up over time. This this slows things down, and standards usually end up in documents instead of being built into the system where they can be tested or validated. This isn't a criticism, it's just the reality of who's involved. And in many ways, it shows the effort of the community, people with deep domain experts turning complex, messy clinical data into something that can actually truly generate evidence. Now let's turn to oncology research specifically. In the observational research community, it's almost a cliche to start by saying oncology data are complicated. But the truth is they really are. And the one-size-fits-all solutions we just discussed often clash with that level of complexity. What makes the cancer patient journey so challenging to describe? A few key factors. First, patients have long timelines with many events and multi-specialty care happening over months or years. Data covers many types of omics and treatments from different specialties, and matching the right treatment to the right indication is often complicated. Tumors can return or progress at unpredictable times, and treatment decisions shift accordingly. And capturing these changes over time requires careful tracking. And finally, treatments are demanding and entirely valid for some variation in care to exist. For instance, a patient might choose to pause or stop their therapy for their own well-being. All of this means that the standard tricks that we use to simplify observational data can quickly run into limits when applied to oncology. Navigating the balance between the general and oncology-specific need is a pattern that we see at many points in the clinical research life cycle. There are a bunch of different clinical data models where you see the same pattern, the tension between general-purpose models and the specific needs of oncology. Many general-purpose clinical and research data models include a tailored set of conventions designed to handle the complexities of cancer care, essentially an oncology-specific layer built on top of the broader model. For example, CDISC has cancer therapeutic area specification for oncology clinical trial. FAIR has encode for operational oncology data capture, and OMOP has the oncology extension for observational studies and real-world evidence. The general model provides the framework for almost anything, while the oncology-specific subset gives us the shortcuts and rules we actually need to model this complexity effectively. The OMOP version of oncology-specific subset keeps the strict structure of the general-purpose tables, but adds a few important changes. The most important is the concept of modifiers. Records from different tables can be linked in predefined ways to produce a richer, more clinically meaningful description of the disease state. For example, disease stage, morphology, and grade aren't just captured. They're now properly tied to the diagnosis record itself, which is critical for our understanding of the patient trajectory. On the surface, this might not sound game-changing, but the impact is big. It turns a limited general model into something truly usable for oncology studies. And the other main innovation comes from the introduction of episodes. linking related events together to describe the full course of the disease from diagnosis, response, recurrence, and survival, as well as grouping treatments into their cycles, regimens, and lines of therapy. This greatly improves our ability to appropriately characterize the target populations of interest. This is an extreme example, but the point remains. It is impossible to single out study populations without linking together complex chains of events across disease progression and lines of therapy. Okay, we have gotten through our first two stories without a single mention of Python. Georgie will share our third and final story, the one on research translation, and what she has developed and which I've been using since I joined the group to work closely with clinicians and answer their questions.
All right, thank you. So at its simplest, research translation is the process of taking insights from the research world and embedding them into care. So they don't just sit in a paper but make actual difference to patients. And it could mean finding a new clinical guideline, building a decision support tool, or even just changing how the care teams reflect on their own practice. At its most ambitious, we do start to approximate the elusive learning health system, which was promised as just around the corner in 2007. Where data-driven knowledge continually drives practice improvement. And I think there's a whole lot of system-wide and systemic reasons for this failure to deliver, but at least one of them is the disconnect between wanting to implement only interventions that have actually been proven to work, but then in the real world of siloed data environments, we struggle to replicate exactly in a different context because the underlying data can't easily be aligned. And I stole this code from a tutorial on getting started with the oncology extension because I think it gives a handle on what is typical in practice. It's a very slight exaggeration because there are some graphical interfaces for generating static queries like this one. So I'm somewhat leaning on the idea of literally having to look up the codes for each and every condition, but not by very much, and if you actually want to explore the data in a hands-on way. And you can see our delightful polymorphic keys make an appearance there as well. So how do you actually use these kinds of static queries to build a learning health system? You don't. We saw an opportunity for enriching the fluency of these investigations with Python. And I wasn't sure how much background I need to provide for this audience because I'm very, very comfortable now giving technical talks to clinicians, which is its own challenge. But this is the first time that we've had the opposite story, so you'll have to forgive me. But just in case you're not familiar with ORMs or object relational mappings, I'll take just a minute to kind of go through the conceptual grounding. So starting with the actual database, hopefully it's fair to assume everyone's got a good mental model for what that looks like. But then we have the application layer, where we describe the code, in code, a representation of the underlying data model. And it allows us to interact with the database records directly as instantiated Python objects. So what does this actually look like? If we look at the mapping of the ubiquitous concept table for a second, table definitions are expressed as classes, a row is an instance of that class, columns are attributes, and the ORM-specific mappings of the columns define the details of things like the keys and the data types. And then finally, we have the abstraction, which is where the guts of the ORM lie. So this provides a translation between the back and the front ends of the stack, doing things like converting the Python code into dialect-specific SQL, and instantiating Python objects that represent the returned results of executed queries. So how does this improve the situation for clinician researchers and for actually getting those results into the clinic? So for one thing, Python objects are far more expressive than the database rows. The generic tables of OMOP can actually be turned into objects that have that can capture their own purpose and their use in practice, which makes it a lot easier for researchers to find the details that they're looking for. So in practice, a richly expressed relational algebra turns many of these queries into functions, which has the side benefit of making the ETL process itself inherently validatable at design time, not just post hoc on the transformed data. A concept object that's returned as a unit concept has enough context to know that it needs to behave differently to one that was returned via value as concept, for a basic example. And this can even extend to that concept object having different behavior depending on further relational details, like dates or age variables. And here are a couple of use cases for why you might want to do this. So the first is what I just mentioned, bringing those data validation checks further up the ETL pipeline. It's a trivial example, but you can use the validates decorator to intercept events when an object is created or modified. And then you raise an exception, so it's impossible to write improperly formed records to the database, or you can choose to handle it and modify the incorrect data before writing it out. And this turns the typical OMOP best practice for post hoc data quality checks on its head. And if you need to reference vocabulary tables to perform the domain checks or similar, you can employ class-level methods instead, pulling in the context when you're building the class. So here are some other examples showing how it's possible to validate one field relative to another within the same table. And furthermore, how you can customize the event that the validation scripts actually listen for, which is very useful when you want to validate complex objects, like episodes, which are built in like a stepwise fashion. And this is a simplified version of our visualization stack. And there's a couple of reasons to do it this way, but I think the main reason that this is an innovation for this user group is that it's all loosely coupled into layers. So it means that you can build and reuse the core application logic in multiple places, just changing the way that we interact with the published API. And then here's a basic version of our API layer, and I always like to stick on that warning there just in case there's any way that people can think we're mishandling our private patient data. But here's an example of where the same underlying condition logic can be applied either as a normal condition via the condition schema, or you can render it as a cancer-specific schema by applying a different serialization logic that starts to pull in those modifier objects that Ghazaleh was telling you about before that just get nested below the parent JSON. And this is one of my proudest moments solving this through the ORM approach, which is the proper handling of the polymorphic relationships between the measurements, observations, and episode tables, because each of these can point to a number of different targets. And so this intermediary class abstracts away that complexity, so it's hidden to the end users. They don't really need to know that they need to look in like 7 different locations to piece together the event trail. It means you can conveniently grab all of the episode events as a collection directly via the events property, instead of needing to handle them as flattened joins against each individual target. And the logical endgame here is this query, where you can return an individual, all of their nested episodes, and all of the episode events of any type with a single call. And final one, but there's a few examples of ways to implement extended properties to build convention logic within the data model definition. And it takes care of all of the complexity of handling, for instance, modality of treatment episodes. And again, it ends up being impossible to misinterpret those documents with long descriptive conventions if you have an agreed implementation of the most important ones. And we do need to do more work on this one in terms of the design patterns for holding the more basic raw objects and then their enriched subclasses, because there is a fairly serious performance implication with this one. And I wanted to end just by rolling back up to the bigger picture as to our kind of whole research program. So we're using these tools all across the research pipeline to identify the unwarranted variation, understand what drives it, and then pushing those insights back into the clinic, all for our ultimate goal of improving patient experience and outcomes. And just to leave you wanting a bit more for next time we come, we're currently using this, all of this is the basis for a whole data visualization framework to support the deployment of these research visualizations directly into the health district environments. So we leverage the highly regularized structure of the common data model to create flexible, arbitrary depth queries for reporting to multidisciplinary team meetings. We have a beta version of the libraries. If you want to have a play, please get into it and let us know what you think. Okay.
Thanks, guys. That was fantastic. We've got time for a few questions. We've got any questions from the audience? And we've got one at the back there.
Thank you for an excellent talk. Given that you're trying to track improvements to the situation, I'm assuming, is that visualization that you're talking about supposed to help see that those changes are having an effect?
Yeah, I mean, so at the moment, the multidisciplinary teams, some of them have some kind of a data-driven practice where they will manually abstract reports that they pull out from all different systems on a 6-monthly cycle, right? And I think for teams who are like that, we've seen that has actually improved practice, but it's on such a long time scale that the answer you get is like, I can't tell you who that was. I'm sure there was a reason that that happened. Oh, we've changed our practice by now. So bringing that closer to real time has the capacity to do that. The other thing as well is like being able to see the trend, because if something's below a given benchmark but it's trending upwards, that's a very different story to something that is just above the benchmark but is trending downwards. So these are the things we're working with the implementation science groups to collaborate with the clinicians and co-design their visualizations that they think will actually make a difference in the clinic.
Paul Leopardi, hi. In your setting, do you have instances where you need to do performance optimization? And if so, how do you go about doing it?
Are you talking about like data performance or clinician performance? Sorry, I assume data?
No, I'm talking about performance of the code, not
Oh,
the
yes.
people.
Oh, yeah. And this is, I think, harking back to one of the talks this morning, where sometimes the SQL is just the right way to do things, but I think that probably is much more relevant in a case where you have something that is designed for these kinds of uses. And there are so many compromises with this schema that the performance is, it doesn't matter what you do, it's going to be slow. And so we are working out the design patterns at the moment, and we've had some like kind of caching and materializing those views as well. So yeah, we are working on it. At the moment, it's a 6-monthly manual process. If we can do a weekly one, that's already huge. So yes and no.
Cool, thanks very much. I did like the comment in there, in the code saying, not really sure this should be repeated in this way.
Yes.
And I guess I'm interested to sort of hear what you've learned about sort of good programming in the process of doing this. What sort of things would you like other people to be doing?
Yeah, again, so we have a lot of trying to make small wins and on-roading, like trying to build on-ramps for people to become familiar with things. And so there are definitely some times where you would like to do something nifty and performant and smart and all these kinds of things, but that actually a big part of our role in the job that we're in is to help people who are keen to kind of develop those practices. So yeah, it is definitely a balance for being able to communicate and try and help people kind of hit that level of complexity that they need to get to. Because there's enthusiasm, a lot of informal kind of ad hoc efforts, but there's not a lot of good cohesion across the practice, I would say.
I think we maybe have time for one last question, if anyone else has anything they want to ask.
Thanks for the talk. You've kind of got this unified semantic ontology for clinicians to use.
Yes.
In my context, I've found that it's great having everyone speaking the same language, but then, or using the same words, but then they use them in different ways, and it's hard to actually, communicate between people. I was wondering if you could comment on how that's been trying to get clinicians to use that language in the right way or in a consistent manner?
Yeah, so the mappings, we don't put any constraints on the data entry side of things. That's a hiding to nothing. What will happen if you do that in too rigid a fashion, they'll just put it in the free text instead. So we don't ask the clinicians to do that, and instead we try and kind of use sort of pragmatic engineering decisions to pull the pipeline, and make sure that we're doing it at the right stage in the process.
Well, thank you very much, guys. Here's a PyCon mug for each of you to say thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.